Okay, class, today we've got chapter 2, constitutional law. Again, this is just going to be a very quick recap of the chapter. We're going to cover some of the highlights. Remember that you do need to read the chapter to get all of the information that you're going to need for the case studies and for any quizzes that come up in the course. But I like to do these virtual lectures to try to give you a little bit more information, real world examples if at all possible. So Chapter 2, Constitutional Law. So some of the learning objectives of this chapter is to help identify state, federal, and international governing bodies that create law, look at different levels of scrutiny by the courts and determine the constitutionality of government action, differentiate between the procedural due process and substantive due process. We'll look at state and federal laws and how they apply, describe the federal government's ability to regulate commerce under the Commerce Clause, and summarize freedom of speech rights available to businesses. And always remember, this is a business law class, so most of the times we're looking at this through the lens of organization as opposed to personal law. So I want to just remind everybody that we want to look through the lens of businesses as opposed to our own individual rights under the law and under Constitution. So basically, one of the things that we've got to look at is the foundation for law in the United States, and that is the Constitution. It sets forth the powers that can be exercised by the government, also provides tells us what the implied powers to undertake actions necessary to carry out any expressed designated powers. The 10th Amendment reserves all powers to the states that have not been expressly delegated to the national government, and states have inherent police powers, including the right to regulate health, safety, morals, and general welfare, as well as licensing, building codes, parking regulations, and zoning restrictions. Again, that comes down to the states in those circumstances. So, some other relations among the states. The Privileges and Immunities Clause prevents a state from imposing unreasonable burdens on the citizens of another state. Basic activities may include the transfer of property, seeking employment, and accessing the court system. And we also have the Full Faith and Credit Clause. This applies only to civil matters, but it ensures the rights to establish under deeds, wills, contracts, and similar instruments in one state will be honored in other states, and that any judicial decision with respect to such as property rights will be honored and enforced in all states. So one of the things that we're well known for here in the United States is the idea of separation of powers, just basically stating that we have three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the Senate. And these different levels or these different checks and balances in the systems help protect us against any one section that might go awry. So the legislative branch can enact a law, but the executive branch can veto it. The executive branch is responsible for foreign affairs, but treaties require consent from the Senate, and Congress determines jurisdiction of federal courts, president appointee, federal judges, but judicial branch has the power to hold actions of the other two branches as unconstitutional. So we're going to get into the Commerce Clause. I've got a video that I'm going to play, but this particular clause of the Constitution has the greatest impact on businesses as far as the Constitution is concerned. So let me see here if the video pulls up.
In this video, we will discuss the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is part of the United States Constitution, and it is a major source of Congress's power to pass laws. The Constitution assigns powers to the different branches of the federal government. Because of the Constitution, some power is assigned to the federal government, some power is reserved for the states, and some power is shared. The federal government's power to act must come from the Constitution. To pass a law, Congress needs authority or power from the Constitution. Without authority from the Constitution, the law is unconstitutional. Think about someone who wants to fly a jet. Before he can fly, he needs some sort of certification. And that certification provides him with the authority to fly. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution provides Congress with much of its authority to enact laws. This clause authorizes Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations and between different states. Congress is empowered to regulate interstate commercial activity. This is often referred to as the Constitution's Interstate Commerce Clause. The Constitution also enables Congress to regulate commercial activity between the United States and other countries. This is commonly known as the International Commerce Clause. And together, the Interstate and International Commerce Clause are often just called the Commerce Clause. So Congress cannot pass just any law that it wants. The law must have a constitutional basis. So if Congress passes a law, we can ask whether the law is related to interstate or international commerce. For example, let's say Congress wanted to pass a law regarding truck safety. If Congress can show that this law is related to interstate commercial activity, then the law should be constitutional under the Commerce Clause. If you'd like to discuss the Commerce Clause or any other matter related to U.S. law.
Okay, so that was a little bit more on the Commerce Clause. Also, one of the things that we need to take into account with the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. And this is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Obviously, we've probably heard of the First Amendment, freedom of religion. The Second Amendment is the right to keep and bear arms. The Third Amendment prohibits lodging of soldiers in any house without owner's consent during peacetime. The Fourth Amendment is unreasonable search and seizure. Fifth Amendment guarantees the right to indictment by a grand jury. The Sixth Amendment is right to a speedy and public trial. Seventh Amendment, right to trial by jury in civil cases. Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail or fines and cruel and unusual punishment. Ninth Amendment establishes people's rights in addition to those specified by the Constitution. And the 10th Amendment established the powers reserved for the states. And again, those 10 amendments make up the Bill of Rights. So originally the Bill of Rights just applied to the federal government, but then later it was incorporated and applied to the states as well. And if you go and look at the state constitution for whatever state you live in, here in Colorado, we have a Colorado Bill of Rights as well. The 14th Amendment provides that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And this comes under judicial interpretation. Generally, when it comes to constitutional law, the Supreme Court has the final say. So if any of these rights come into question, it can go through a court process. And then if at some point it gets appealed, it can go all the way to the Supreme Court. They have the final say on any constitutional rights. So the First Amendment, freedom of speech. So the right for free speech, it's a basis for our democratic government. It also includes any symbolic speech, including gestures, movements, articles of clothing, things like that. Obviously, we have to have some restrictions on freedom of speech. Generally, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but if they're going to cause the public harm by whatever, the prime example that's used is yelling fire in a crowded theater would cause people to run towards the exits and trample each other. You don't get that type of freedom of speech in those circumstances. Commercial speech consists of communications primarily in the arena of business, so we can think of advertising and marketing, and it gives substantial protection of commercial speech. So restrictions, if the if there's substantial government interest, directly advance the interest and go no further than necessary. So in those circumstances, I know that we've seen a lot of fake advertising. Companies, they'll do things comically in order to get your attention and things like that. So they get a very wide berth on the type of free speech that are used, especially in things like advertising and marketing. Some of the speech that's not protected would be anything that's threatening. So if it poses a true threat, also anything that's considered to be obscene, and then obviously anything that can would affect a child, like child pornography, would obviously be unprotected free speech in those circumstances. And then we move up to this idea of procedural due process. Any government decision to take a life, liberty, or property must be fair, requires notice and a fair hearing. And under the area of substantive due process, it focuses on the content of the legislation, so the right itself in those circumstances. Courts apply different tests to measure whether or not things are being treated fairly. So the government must treat similar situations of individuals or businesses in the same manner. So again, going back to the idea of precedent and how important that is in our law, if it's been ruled on this way before, chances are the law is going to rule in the same manner moving forward. They have to have strict scrutiny. So if a law or action prohibits or inhibits some persons from exercising a fundamental right, the law or action will be subject to strict scrutiny by the courts. So anything that's going to hold back people's general rights, they're going to fall under strict scrutiny as far as courts are concerned. Intermediate scrutiny, so this applies in cases involving discrimination against gender or legitimacy. And these laws use classifications that could be substantially related to important government objectives. So the state also plays an important objective in estimating time limits. And so in a lot of cases, they have to have what's called a statute of limitation, which means that if a crime's been committed, you have to bring that to bear in the court, whether it's civil or criminal, by some timeline. Now, there are some things that don't fall under the statute of limitations. There are some examples of things that don't have a timeline in which the government has to bring you to court. But for the most part, many acts against the law, against statutes, anything like that, have what's called a statute of limitation, which is a timeline. So some other areas of protection, we have these different acts that have been enacted. So the Freedom of Information Act, this just states that you can file a request to receive information that the government's withholding, and they're only allowed to withhold it for a predetermined amount of time. There are certain instances where if it's deemed necessary to protect the national interest of the country, it may be held longer. And then there's other circumstances where a court can decide, well, no, it's no longer really that meaningful to hold on to this information, and then release the information to the public. The Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, the Privacy Act of 1974, and the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. Driver's Privacy Protection Act, Health Insurance Profitability and Accountability Act, also known as HIPAA, protects mainly your personal information in a medical setting, so that people don't get a hold of your medical records and things like that, and then deny you, say coverage, or deny you a job based on things that are found in your medical records. Financial Services and Modernization Act, other pieces of legislation that have been passed. The Freedom of Information Act we already talked about. Actually, these were all the ones we just mentioned, all summarized, and you can find these, I believe, in the textbook as well. And let's see if this video plays.
Protection and constitutional scrutiny. The 14th Amendment provides that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. This means that governments must treat people equally. However, governments often make laws which treat people unequally based on certain classifications. People with higher incomes pay a higher tax rate, and only those people with lower incomes are entitled to certain welfare benefits. Some of these classifications are okay, but others are not. Whenever government action involves the classification of people, the government must satisfy its duty to treat people equally under the Constitution, which is determined by one of three tests. 1. The strict scrutiny test. 2. The intermediate test. 3. The rational relationship test. Anytime a government action classifies people based on race or ethnicity, or if it impacts an individual's fundamental rights, the courts will apply the strict scrutiny test. This requires that the government action be necessary to promote a compelling state interest in order to be considered valid. Very few actions meet this test. A classic example occurred in 1954 during the case Brown versus Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court ruled that the segregation of the public school system based on race was unconstitutional. More recently, the Supreme Court applied the strict scrutiny test to state bans of same-sex marriages. In its analysis, it stated that marriage was a fundamental right protected by the Equal Protection Clause, and therefore states were not entitled to deny protections afforded to married couples based on their sexual orientation. If a government action classifies individuals based on sex or gender, the courts will apply the intermediate scrutiny test. The action must be substantially related to important government objectives to be valid. In 1996, the Supreme Court invalidated the Virginia Military Institute's, a state school, policy excluding all women from admission. All other actions related to economic and social issues are presumed valid and will be upheld so long as they are rationally related to a legitimate goal. Because excluding methadone users was rationally related to the safety of public transport, the Supreme Court upheld a policy by the New York Transit Authority to automatically exclude all methadone users from employment. Applying these three tests, courts determine whether a government action or law unconstitutionally discriminates against groups of individuals, resulting in them being treated unequally under the law. Any law or action falling into this category will be declared unconstitutional and invalid. Equal protect.
All right, and so that's everything we've got for today. Just watch for any new announcements involving the case studies or upcoming assignments or quizzes. Other than that, I think that's everything I have for you today. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.